Hey everyone, hope you're all doing well. In this video, I want to talk about the difference between claims and evidence, and potentially use this as a jumping off point for probably a number of other topics related to epistemology. Now, epistemology is the branch of philosophy related to knowledge, what it is, whether a belief that someone holds is justified, and what methods can be used to strengthen that justification. Now, full disclosure, I am not a philosopher. But science is all about building models that accurately reflect reality, as demonstrated by their ability to predict the outcome of future experiments and observations. The practice of science is all about using tests to evaluate whether a model holds up to scrutiny, whether that model has evidential justification. So my thoughts on this topic come from that kind of a practical application perspective. But again, I'm not a philosopher, so take that all with a grain of salt. So part of this is getting towards the idea of what methods do we use to evaluate claims. Okay. So let's make sure that we define all of our terms, since some of these words are used differently in different kinds of contexts. When I'm talking about a claim, it's a statement that something is true about some subject. It's currently raining outside. I have $10 million in my bank account. If object A applies a force to object B, then object B also applies a force to object A of equal magnitude but opposite direction. All of these claims could be true, or some of these claims could be not true. So again, a claim is just a statement that something is true about some subject. Now, belief, at least in the context that I'm using it, is the assessment that some claim about the world is true or likely true. This does not mean absolute certainty. We can have tentative beliefs that are our current best understandings that are also subject to revision when we're presented with new data. This is not saying that our beliefs can't or shouldn't change when presented with additional data. So for example, when I drive my car, I believe that the brakes will work. I am convinced that they are working properly. If I wasn't convinced that they weren't working properly, I'd probably take my car in to get it checked. And this belief is based on the previous performance, the last time I drove the car. And even with that previous performance, I still test out the brakes if I'm starting to drive a little bit, backing out of some parking lot or starting to drive. You test the brakes a little bit to make sure that they're still working. And if you start hearing noises with the brakes, you are getting new information, well, then you reevaluate that belief and maybe take it into an expert who can run additional tests to identify potential problems. Again, none of this requires absolute certainty, but when we have a belief on some kind of topic, an assessment that some claim is true, we have at least enough confidence that we're able to make informed decisions, even though we don't have absolute certainty. Now, it is important to recognize that we can hold beliefs for good reasons, and we can hold beliefs for bad reasons. So, kind of our goal in this is to say, I want to develop some kind of methodology for assessing which claims are true or likely true, and which claims are false or likely false. And both of those elements are important. We want both sides of this to be as accurate as possible, because our beliefs, the claims about the world that we accept as true, those beliefs affect how we act, and those actions have consequences. So we want our internal model of reality to match the external world as accurately as possible. If we were to set our bar for accepting a claim, like how much evidence we require to accept that claim, if we were to set that bar too low, we believe everything, potentially even things that are contradictory. And then when we run into a situation where those different beliefs are in conflict with each other, we don't necessarily have a way to move forward. If we set the bar for even tentative conditional acceptance of a claim to be too high, then we'd believe absolutely nothing, and we'd be kind of stuck in a state of nihilistic inaction. For example, if I needed a ridiculously high bar of of evidence to even tentatively accept that my brakes are going to work while I'm driving, I'd never drive anywhere. We perform a test, maybe as we're starting to drive, just test the brakes a little bit, make sure everything's working, and then, okay, that is our tentative conclusion until we start getting new data and hearing, oh, the brakes might not be working as well. So again, we need this method, some kind of set of methods for assessing which claims are true or likely true, and which claims are false or likely false. And this is kind of the heart of what skepticism is. Skepticism, at least for the purposes of this discussion, again, there are different definitions, is the idea that belief in a claim should be withheld until sufficient evidence is presented. And even after that evidence is presented, our beliefs should still be tentative and subject to revision given new, better information. Okay. Also, when I say that belief in a claim should be withheld until sufficient evidence is presented, that doesn't mean that we should accept the negation of that claim. For example, if someone claims that it's raining outside, and maybe I don't trust them enough to just take them at their word for this pretty mundane fact, but if someone says that it's raining outside and they don't present evidence, that doesn't mean I'm justified in saying it's not raining outside. I would have to be in a state where I'm just simply saying, I don't know whether it's raining outside. You haven't presented any evidence to support that claim. So we want to make sure that any claims that we accept, we want those to be based on evidence. So let's talk about evidence a little bit. Again, we said a claim is a statement that something is true about some subject. Okay? The evidence is the set of data that is consistent with the claim and that we would not expect to be consistent with competing claims. Okay? So let's kind of break this down a little bit. Let's say I claim that it's currently raining outside. Okay? So the claim is outside it is raining. It is true that this precipitation, water is falling from the sky right now. To provide evidence for that, I could pull the blinds up, point my camera outside, and we can look and see if there is water falling from the sky. Or I could take a camera outside along with an empty glass, and I hold that empty glass out and say, look, the empty glass is filling with water as I hold it out there. Both of those observations would be consistent with the claim that it is raining outside, and would not likely be consistent with the competing claim that it is clear outside. And those pieces of evidence would probably be enough to convince someone that, yes, it likely is raining outside. You know, maybe I'm tricking you, maybe I've got someone on the roof of the building with a hose or a sprinkler that's spraying water down, but again, it's reasonably convincing evidence, especially for a claim as mundane as it's raining outside. Okay. But let's look at another example, because we have this idea that the data should be consistent with the claim and not expected to be consistent with competing claims. So for example, let's imagine that there was a hit and run incident, and someone claimed that I was the perpetrator of this hit and run incident. Would the fact that I own a car be evidence that I was the perpetrator in this hit and run? Not really. You know, my having access to a car is consistent with the claim because the perpetrator of the hit and run should have access to the car, but so do most other people. Most people have access to a car. So the competing claim that I was not involved, this piece of evidence, the fact that I have access to a car, is consistent with those competing claims. We would have to say, well, what type of car was it? What was the make and model and color of the car? If that matches the car that I have access to, well, that significantly narrows down the number of people that would have access to that specific kind of car, the kind of car that was involved in the hit and run. But I haven't even said where this took place. Maybe this hit and run took place in a completely different country. So we'd need more evidence to say, oh, I was also near the location. Maybe we have cell phone tracking data that shows that, oh, my cell phone was right there, moving quickly at the same time as the accident happened, those would be more pieces of data that are consistent with the claim that I was the perpetrator in this, that we would not expect to be consistent with the competing claims of, if I'm not the perpetrator, it seems a very large coincidence that I would be driving that kind of car at that time, at that location. Again, that would be a much stronger piece of evidence if it's not consistent with those competing claims. Okay? And there's actually a mathematical method, and we'll probably make at least one video on this, called Bayes' theorem, that gives a quantitative method of actually evaluating how strong a piece of evidence is by comparing how likely was that piece of data, given the claim is true, compared to how likely is that piece of data if we assume that the claim is false. Again, that's not exactly Bayes' theorem, but we'll do that in a separate video. Again, it's a method of evaluating how strong a piece of evidence is. Okay? And to quote David Hume, a wise person proportions their belief to the evidence. So if we have multiple pieces of data that are both consistent with the claim and that we would not expect to be consistent with competing claims, well, if all those pieces of data point towards this claim, then it's extremely unlikely that all those pieces of data would have been wrong by just coincidence or anything like that. So that would be a large amount of evidence, and we would have a strong confidence that this claim is true. Again, not absolute confidence, but a much higher level of confidence. If we only have a few pieces of data that are generally consistent with the claim and are not super likely to happen by mistake, well, we might only have a little bit of confidence that that claim is true. You know, maybe just a tentative acceptance, like I think this is true, but I'm not entirely sure. And if we only have like maybe one or two pieces of data that are not all that consistent with the claim, but not, and also could be just a fluke or a mistake, then we might not have any confidence at all and just say, again, go back to that skepticism idea of saying, I'm going to withhold accepting this claim, withhold belief in that claim until more evidence is presented. Okay. So, kind of expanding off of this, when someone makes a positive claim saying X is the case, you know, it's raining outside, I have $10 million in my bank account, making some kind of claim, if they want anyone else to take that claim seriously, they adopt a burden of proof. They are required to provide the evidence. If they want to convince you, they have to provide the evidence that should be sufficient to convince a reasonable person. And this burden of proof applies whether the claim is that X is true or that X is not true. Both of those would have a burden of proof. If I say it's raining outside, I adopt the burden of proof. I have to demonstrate that it's raining outside. If I say it is not raining outside, I also adopt the burden of proof. I would have to show you that it is not raining outside. And again, this burden of proof applies for anyone making a claim. And if you want someone to take that claim seriously, you have to provide the evidence to back it up. So let's look at a case in some detail. Suppose I make the claim that I have $10 million in my bank account. The fact that I'm making this claim could be considered as part of the evidence. I'm telling you that I have $10 million in my bank account. But this is exceptionally weak evidence. We know that people can be mistaken. We know that people can intentionally lie. And those would be competing claims. And if those competing claims are true, I'm lying or I'm mistaken, you might still expect me to say that I have $10 million in my bank account. That goes back to this idea that evidence should be consistent with the claim and not consistent with competing claims. Again, the idea that I'm just mistaken or intentionally lying, both of those are competing claims. So again, me saying that I have $10 million in my bank account, me making that claim could constitute evidence, but personal eyewitness testimony, things like that, are exceptionally weak evidence. So what might count as better evidence? Well, I could present you with a printed out bank statement that says, oh, I have this much money in my bank account. It is possible that I could fake that, but it is less likely. It takes a little bit more effort to fake a bank statement. And that would narrow down the possibility that I'm just mistaken. If I'm mistaken, I'm probably not presenting a bank statement saying that I have this much money in my account. I could give you a notarized letter from the bank saying how much money is in my account. That would be significantly harder to fake. Or I could invite you to come to the bank with me and get the information directly from a teller. All of these would be stronger and stronger pieces of evidence that I have $10 million in my bank account. What if, instead of presenting bank statements or bringing you to the bank and having you talk to the teller and having them confirm what's in my bank account, instead of doing that, imagine I said that I have $10 million in my bank account because I just sold my mansion for $10 million. Would that constitute evidence? No. That would simply be another claim with no more backing than the original claim about my bank account. Unless there were some other kind of data to back up this second claim, unless you already knew that I had lived in a mansion before and knew that it was up for sale, or I could present a bill of sale or something like that, this second claim wouldn't move us any closer to being convinced of the first claim. If separate evidence that I had owned a mansion were presented, then that would be supporting evidence for both of those claims about my bank account, since I now have evidence for a plausible source of money, but it's the evidence that should drive our confidence of the claim, not just more claims. The main point here is making additional claims does not constitute evidence. Every additional claim I make would need to also be demonstrated with its own set of evidence. So just making more claims doesn't add anything to my case. It's the evidence, the data, the confirmable data that is consistent with the claim and not consistent with competing claims. That's what should determine how confident we are as to whether this claim is true, false, or we just don't have enough data to identify this. A good quote that kind of highlights some of these points are a quote from the late Christopher Hitchens: "What can be asserted without evidence, or claimed without evidence equivalently, what can be asserted without evidence can also be dismissed without evidence." If I claim that I have $10 million in the bank, and someone else claims, no, you don't have $10 million in the bank, unless one of us actually provides any actual evidence, both of those claims are on equal footing, so we can dismiss both of those claims equally. Again, not accepting their negation, not saying, oh, I know you don't have $10 million in the bank account, simply saying, if all you're giving me is claims, there's no way for me to evaluate, there's no evidence for me to look at to evaluate whether those claims are true or likely true, or false or likely false. It's the data that is important, not additional claims. As an example of this, directly from my channel, I have some recent videos where I went through a lever launcher experiment to demonstrate the concept of conservation of angular momentum. The setup involved having a horizontal lever where I launched one object at the lever, it hit the end of one end of the lever, and that caused it to rotate, launching another object. And I went through what happens when we change the masses, what happens when we change where those objects are located. And in a previous video, I had gone through my predictions, what the standard kind of physics textbook concepts suggest should happen to this lever. Again, highlighting the importance of conservation of angular momentum for those systems, and then giving us kind of a range on what should happen in the elastic case when it's bouncy objects hitting the lever, or what would happen in the inelastic case if we have things like clay and it's going to absorb more of the energy. So kind of giving us the key concepts and what is the range of outcomes that we would expect. If I would have just left it at, here's what classical physics says should happen to the lever, therefore classical physics is correct, you would rightly reject that claim because it's missing the necessary supporting evidence, which is why I actually did the work and went through the experiment, showed full details on how I set up the experiment, how I took the data, the different cases, analyzing the data, and actually demonstrating that for this kind of lever system, the important quantity is the conservation of angular momentum. And then after that, depending on the springiness of the impacting objects, whether they're hitting with a spring or hitting with clay, those should be at different points in the range between the completely elastic and completely inelastic cases. But again, we need the data. If I want my claim to be taken seriously, I need to show the data that actually demonstrates the claim and hopefully makes a convincing case. Now, another quote that you may have heard of before relating to claims and evidence is the quote from Carl Sagan, "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." When a claim is presented to us, we have in our minds a set of previously established beliefs, ideally beliefs based on strong evidence, and these may or may not comport with the new claim. If a claim includes aspects that either lack prior evidence or have, worse off, contradictory prior evidence, then before we're likely to accept this new claim, we need to have extra evidence in support of each of those individual components and explain what might have been wrong with any contradictory evidence that we've previously seen. For example, suppose I said, "This morning I drove my car to work." Well, you probably already accept that cars exist, people drive them, people go to work, and often people's jobs start in the morning. So, in your mind, almost automatically, you can quickly assess that many of the elements of this claim are already accepted. So this is a fairly mundane claim, so you might just take me at my word that I drove my car to work this morning. If instead I said, "This morning I rode my horse to work," well, you probably accept that horses exist, but you also know that a much smaller portion of the population own a horse and would ride one to work. You might want to see a picture of me with my horse and maybe a bit of explanation of where I work and what some issues might come up in terms of how do I ride my horse to work, or maybe come by and see the horse. The claim is more unlikely, so more evidence is required to meet all of those claim components. What if I said, "This morning I flew on my pet dragon to my castle in the mountains"? Well, you'd need evidence that dragons exist, that I have one, that the dragon is both willing and able to let me ride it, that I have a castle in the mountains, and that I actually did all of this stuff this morning. Again, there's multiple nested claims inside of that one claim. And since I'm guessing that you don't currently accept that dragons exist, at least for starters, me showing you a picture of me on my dragon probably wouldn't be convincing enough because, again, pictures can be faked. This is an extraordinary claim, so it would require extraordinary evidence, much stronger evidence. So again, when we have one of these extraordinary claims that kind of goes against what we've previously got as our set of accepted premises, we'd have to provide additional evidence for those associated claims and, again, to explain any potentially contradictory prior evidence that we have seen before. So as an example of this, let's consider an entirely hypothetical example where an entirely fictional person, let's call them Bob Smith, makes a claim. Suppose BS is convinced that the bulk of our collective understanding of physics is wrong, and this fictional person thinks that conservation of energy is entirely made up, and the only thing that matters in every type of system is the magnitude of momentum. Again, contrary to classical physics. This is quite the claim, in part because it would require that scientists and engineers in every field from around the world who have demonstrated their collective expertise through their ability to design, prototype, and manufacture everything from cars to spacecraft to computers to skyscrapers to power plants to chemical engineering to robotics and so on, all of them would all need to either be mistaken or lying about the very basic fundamental principles of their fields. Note that this is not an argument from authority. I wouldn't say that everyone must believe the scientific community because they're experts. I'm citing this as a piece of supporting data from, again, demonstrated experts, demonstrated by their ability to build these technologies that can do all these things. So, in Bob Smith's claim, where all of these experts are wrong at an incredibly basic, introductory, fundamental level, BS would need to explain how all of these experts could be so wrong, yet still able to make all the technology that we use every day. But even without that, when any claim is made, evidence is required to support it. So let's continue with this hypothetical. So imagine if, in this hypothetical example, Bob followed up this claim by saying, if you take that toy where you have a stack of bouncy balls, where the bottom one is the heaviest and they keep getting lighter, when you drop them all, the one at the top ends up being launched very quickly. And I think you might get maybe 4 times more kinetic energy out of the last object than all the total energy you started with. And that's it. No demonstration of how fast the objects actually move in this case. No calculations of any kind. Just, I think you'll violate conservation of energy. This is simply another claim that is entirely unsubstantiated. But imagine our imaginary Bob isn't done yet. He states, if I have a pressurized vessel and a valve with stoppers at 2 ends, and those stoppers get launched by the pressurized vessel, and then I lock one end in place, the other end will launch at twice the speed, which means it's got more energy than the original case, and that violates conservation of energy. And then he says, gear systems will launch in this way, and lever systems will work in this way, and Newton's cradles will work in this way, and dropping objects on springs will work in that way, and they'll all violate conservation of energy. But during all of this, Bob does no experiments to provide evidence for these claims, and the few times that videos of other experiments are presented, an accurate analysis actually shows that they go against his claims. In this hypothetical, all Bob has provided are a series of claims upon claims. No evidence to back up any of these claims whatsoever, and actually some evidence that refutes it. Coupled with the fact that a key underlying premise of BS's claims, that it's the magnitude of momentum that's our important quantity, has been repeatedly disconfirmed by multiple independent experiments. Given all of this, that we just have claims and contradictory evidence that goes against the claim, how seriously should we take BS's nested stack of claims? Remember, that which is asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. It's a good thing that this is a hypothetical scenario. Anyways, that's it for this video. Thank you as always for the view. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.